Three, two, and now it's time for the creative outlet segment. And we have two wonderful young ladies with us. Of course, let's welcome Kelly Thompson and Meredith McClaren. How are you doing? Welcome to the show.
Good, good. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I'm good too.
Well, we're actually lucky enough to, the fine folks at Image Comics actually reached out to us and said, "Hey, you got to talk to these ladies. They're just awesome." So, you guys want to talk to us about Black Cloak #1?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad Image reached out to you. We've been doing a lot of these interviews and stuff, and Meredith and I both commented that because it's my first real book at Image. I did one of the shorts in the Silver Coin, or one of the stories in the Silver Coin anthology story that Image did, that Michael Walsh's book. So, but that's really my first thing with Image, and so this is big for me. And Meredith has been here before, but she said that this had been like a much bigger rollout, and so it was sort of crazy for us. So we really appreciate you taking the time. I know we're playing on a big stage in that it's Image, but it's still an indie book, and you got to fight hard to sort of get people to notice it, especially if you're doing something a little different or a little unexpected. So we've been really excited about the support and excitement Images have for the book.
That's awesome. And
I'm very excited for you guys.
Very much so. And so tell everybody out there who hasn't been lucky enough to take a peek at this comic yet, all about it and how you guys came up to it.
So I brought Meredith in to work on this sort of weird little idea I had called Black Cloak. That is basically it's a detective story. So it's got a procedural element. You've got a murder in your first issue and you're trying to solve that murder. But the setting is a sort of Blade Runner-y sci-fi fantasy world. So you've got all sorts of creatures and you've got a lot of tech and magic sort of fighting with each other a little bit. It's a really incredible world, and we're really having fun building it. But then, it's just got this sort of very steady procedural thread that sort of leads you through it to sort of tying together sort of the politics and the problems in this world with, some big murdery stuff.
Yeah, Kelly likes to preface it a lot by saying that she just put all the things that she loves in one place. And so I really approach it that way too. It's like everything I love to draw is here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be like, oh yeah, we're out here reinventing the wheel and we're geniuses, but I do think there's some real joy in not, I don't know, whatever. It's your peanut butter in my chocolate. No, your chocolate's in my peanut butter. Like why should sci-fi have to not have magic and fantasy creatures in it? Like, I don't know why they can't be blended together and like create something fun and interesting. And it's not that nobody's done that before, but they tend to be seen as pretty separate things, like, oh, lasers in space, sci-fi, magic and cloaked elves, fantasy. And I'm like, what? Let's do it all. I'm like that taco girl gif or whatever. Like, why not both? What's gonna hurt us? Like, and especially working with someone like Meredith, she draws a lot of inspiration from a lot of disparate places. Like, I feel like she's really interested in, like, she's really inspired by a lot of comics and fashion and locations, and she travels way more than I do, so she's inspired by her travel locations. And again, it's like, we didn't want to make something that looked just Western, but we also didn't want to make something that looked just Eastern, especially, we're both white people, so like maybe not. But I think the world of Kyros and the world of Black Cloak it really benefits from Meredith especially, but I hope me a little bit too, like just having a lot of different interests and tastes and like not agreeing with the idea that they should stay separate. Like, blend them all up and let's see what we get. I find it really fun.
That's pretty awesome.
Looking at the first issue, the preview that we got, it looks great, looks fantastic. Obviously, yes. I find that I also recognize the procedural element of it, but in a much different setting. Kelly, I'm really familiar with your work for Marvel, and especially you did Hawkeye, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Jessica Jones, right?
Yep.
And I love those books. So thank you for those. But how was it to create this whole universe? Go from working in a universe where you get to play with toys, but now these toys you're building yourself.
It's tricky. I mean, I've done, Meredith and I, one of my very first projects in comics was a creator-owned book for Dark Horse that Meredith and I did together called Heart in a Box. And, there was some world building we were doing there in the sense that there's a non-normal element that sort of runs through that book. But you're right. But that book is otherwise very straightforwardly the real world. And so, yeah, this is a lot to take on. But having worked with Meredith before and knowing what she can do, and also knowing how much our interests collided, like we're both very interested in like monsters and, fantasy and mythology and like these kinds of bigger stories that have sort of iconic ideas in them. So I knew that I was sort of partnering with the right person, that I could, sort of vomit up a lot of words to her about like the kind of ideas I was interested, and I knew we could get on the page really quickly. And not to overhype Meredith, but I just really think she's a genius. I think she designs in a really smart
Wow.
way. And I also think she's got a style that is on the surface doesn't feel like a fantasy style, which I think plays to our strengths a little bit. Like it's very clean and sharp and not sort of fussy in a way that sometimes fantasy stuff is. And I don't mean fussy as a negative. I just mean more detailed, more sort of scratchy, sometimes looser. But Meredith's got a really clean, tight style that I think, so even when she designs like this crazy character, it still always feels really like her, which allows for a lot of consistency across the book to me and how it looks and holds together. And all of that seems like it's not a big deal, but I think in cohesive world building, it's honestly the linchpin. And that's why, pick the right artists, because they're going to be building those, they're going to be putting those blocks in, whatever you think in your head it's going to be, they're in charge of like really bringing that to life. And I'm very lucky to have Meredith on that.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. It's funny that you say that, because it's like when we first started and I knew it was a fantasy book, I was a fantasy sci-fi, but the fantasy part, I'm like, okay. I was looking at books like Monstrous and stuff, and I'm like, my heart ached because I'm like, I do not have the time to put in this amount of detail.
I mean, listen, Monstrous is beautiful, and I don't make any argument, for us over them. It's more of just my argument of, hey, why not us plus them? Like, I think Meredith did have concerns, when we were first talking about the world. I was telling her I didn't want it to be just like a straight up fantasy book, that I really wanted to infuse it with these sort of Blade Runner sci-fi elements, not just because I love sci-fi, but also because I think the Blade Runner of it all, I mean, the reason I dropped that isn't just because of the color palettes and stuff, it's because that also has a detective. I mean, you're following a detective doing his job, basically, in a sense, right? And so, but she expressed some concern. She's like, I really like that idea. She was like, but I know some people who are sort of playing with those things, and so I want to make sure we're doing something different in that. And so we really did our due diligence, I think, in making sure we were doing something different. But to be honest, I was never worried about it, because I just don't think Meredith's stuff looks like anyone else's. She really brings a uniqueness to the work. And so in my mind, like, I wanted to be like cautious about it and do the right thing and make sure we weren't biting anyone's stuff or whatever. But I was never really worried about it, because when I look around, I can see the stuff Meredith's influenced by sometimes, but her style really just always looks wholly her own to me. And I think it paid off. I think Black Cloak doesn't really look like anything else out there.
Yeah. Well, and then also Kelly writes such characters and environments that are like, they're palpable. You can feel them. Like they don't feel like a different genre. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like, it feels like a casual conversation,
Yes.
It's good.
Yeah, I feel that as well in her writing. But Meredith, I must admit, this is the first time I've seen your work, and I'm blown away. I do agree with Kelly that it's very, it's unique, but it seems to be grounded in some familiar aspects. And the storytelling is unique. What are your influences?
I definitely grew up on a lot of anime. Yeah, that's
I definitely could see it. I definitely could see it.
Nobody's going to be surprised by that. But then I moved from anime to French and European comic books, which I think influence a lot of my color aspirations. Like I still feel I'm working towards something there, because they have these beautiful like animation quality books out there. So definitely, those are definitely the two main sources.
And I have to ask too, in addition to your work, obviously one thing I noticed was the color palettes that you guys are using to create the world. As Kelly mentioned, it's a very much a procedural. Usually detective stories, murder mysteries are kind of darkish, especially when you're in a dystopian sort of end of the world kind of story. And even some fantasy elements, or fantasy stories, I find are lean towards more to the dark side. But is it just to be, I mean, obviously you're not being different just to be different, but what decisions were there when you were choosing the color palettes to choose from?
I know that when Kelly first mentioned Blade Runner, the only thing about that scared me was I'm like, I remember watching Blade Runner and I remember not being able to parse a lot of what was happening because it was so dark.
Yeah.
I'm like, is that the avenue we want to go down?
So I think neo-noir gets overused a lot, so forgive me for overusing it here, but I do think it really applies here, because I do think the difference between, when you've got typical noir, one of the aesthetic differences is I would think of a typical noir as being very dark and moody and maybe even black and white, depending. And then when you say neo-noir, the aesthetic to me immediately shifts to more neons, a more modern detective story, and sometimes sci-fi, although obviously like futuristic stories. And so I wanted to lean into that. I wanted to lean into this idea that this walled city of Kyros, which is supposedly the last city in the known world, that because it has to encompass everything, it has everything. So you've got this sort of older, more Western style palaces that are at like the top of the city. And then like as it gets lower and lower, it gets darker and darker, so that these people are sometimes not even seeing the sun, which then gives us a real excuse for, all right, well, what is all this neon lighting look like? What do these districts look like? But then we also have things like the Trees, which is one of my favorite neighborhoods, which is more organic, and then the Lagoon, which is one of the only sort of pure places beyond the castle where you're like actually seeing natural light and stuff. So we just wanted to give it a lot of levels and corners to explore. I'm not saying there's nothing outside of those walls, but our focus was on this is their world, what lives inside this world, and what lives inside the city. And for reasons nobody is really talking about, you can't really leave the city, so we got to make it everything, from nightclubs and farms to a castle and police department and a lagoon and a video game thing. I mean, it's just everything. So fortunately for me, Meredith is really good at switching those things up. She's gotten in the habit of sending me, she knows I'm so particular about color, that she's gotten in the habit of
trying to be efficient, Kelly.
It's the greatest idea ever. It's the greatest idea ever. I'm just sad that I'm so predictable. She's taken to, if she starts coloring a scene, she'll send me like the first page and she's like, how do you feel about the tones? And I'll be like, oh my God, I love it. Or I'll be like, what about blue? Whatever. But she's I think Meredith's a magician with color, especially, and I always push her a little bit on that, because I think that she just sort of naturally on her first pass does it so well that like occasionally, you know, you just stop, because when something seems great, you're like, okay, I'm done. And so I do think sometimes, I think it was one of the great examples of something that happened very early with us on this book in particular, with also our editor Charles, where we were really messing with that first page, because it's the first page and it's also an exterior view of the city, and so it was going to say so much and we had to be careful about it. So that was like one of the pages we went back and forth the most on. And like when I look at those two now, you know, when she sent me the first color pass, I loved it so much. I was so in love with it. But yet when I look at where we landed, where we ended up compared to that first one she sent, it's like night and day. So I think it's just a good testament to how important collaboration is in comics. Like, it's very hard to make something alone in your room by yourself and not have people you trust looking at it and going, holy crap, you nailed this, or you got it, but is it far enough, you know? Or like, I just think that stuff is so important. And it's important too. I mean, Meredith sometimes gives me, you know, she told me not so long ago this line she really liked, and honestly that compliment stayed with me for months, because it really meant something to me that I can give her so much text that she parses and turns into this beautiful stuff, and that anything I would say would stay with her long enough through everything we go through. I don't know, it meant a lot. So it's
awesome.
a great thing. It's great to work with people you like who are good at their jobs.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean,
sort of everything.
I'm
I
so
don't know what
pleased.
that.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's right. Go ahead.
I'm so pleased that Kelly has pushed me the way that she has, because I've made so many tremendous strides just in figuring out coloring passes because of this book, and I'm just like, I really feel like I advanced with it. And
You totally did.
Yeah, I'm really,
I really think you did. I really think you did.
So how many issues are there going to be of the series?
So the first arc is 6 issues. And where we leave that, we leave it in a place where it wraps up this sort of primary story here and sort of sets us up for the continued stories of Black Cloak. And I think that can take a lot of different shapes and forms. And I think what it ultimately takes sort of depends on the audience. You know, if people really go nuts for it, I think we'll do a lot in this world. If people like it, we'll do as much as we can, you know. But I know fans don't love that answer. You'd love to like commit to something knowing it's going to be 50 issues. And listen, I love that too, but that's just not sort of the reality.
Of course, who doesn't want that? Of course.
But I think we'll know pretty early in 2023, like how well we're doing and how much we can afford to invest in doing more. We have a lot of interesting ideas. And one of the great things about Black Cloak is that while the second story probably does continue Essex and Pax stories, we can also do side stories that are just set in that world that have nothing to do with them. So the world of Black Cloak is very exciting to me. It's Meredith and I talked a little bit on another interview about it reminding us a little bit of Arcane. I don't know. Sure. That's based on the video game. It's an animation. Mm-hmm. It's very good for anyone who hasn't seen it. It's based off the League of Legends. That's League right. League of Legends, right? Yeah, the League of Legends games, which I've never played, but which my partner and I watched Arcane, and we just fell so in love with it. And I do think it was like world building and character work. And it really reminded me, like, if you can nail that stuff, you can really win the hearts and minds of the people, you know?
That's awesome. That is really awesome. So
when is the first issue available?
It'll be out 1/11/23, so second week of the new year, and it is oversized. It's like 50 plus pages for only $4.99. So
definitely check it out at your local comic shop, folks.
Local comic shop, people.
We love our local comic shops.
Shop local.
Yes, whenever you can.
Absolutely.
Is there anything else you guys want to promote or anything?
That's really that's what we're doing right now, man. We're pretty focused. I mean, I've got some Marvel stuff still going on, and I've got some other stuff planned for 2023, including The Cull with Maddie Adelius, who Michael, you said you like Jessica Jones. He was the artist on
Yep.
Jessica Jones. So he
Yep.
and I are doing
Yep.
The
Good
Cull.
stuff.
There's an ad for that in your first issue of Black Cloak too. So
Wonderful. That is
Yeah.
awesome, guys. Well, thank you for taking the time to join with us. We really do appreciate it, and looking forward to seeing what happens with Black Cloak.
Awesome. Thank you.
thank you guys so much for having us.
Absolutely.
Let's take a quick break, and then we'll close up the show.